Are you interested in learning more about Southeast Asia because you want to travel there or you're just interested in the place? If so, that's what I would love to talk about in this video today, because I just went on a trip through Southeast Asia where I traveled to 6 different countries. I challenged myself to at least read one book on every country that I went to, because I am a sociology professor, and so I really wanted to take this opportunity of traveling in Southeast Asia to educate myself on sociological issues within those countries and to really understand the places. My name is Dr. Beverly Yin Thompson, and I'm a sociology professor who's focused my research on digital nomads. And so I have a somewhat critical perspective on digital nomads. Most specifically, my main critique is that digital nomads don't really take the time to really engage with the place that they are traveling and perhaps living in long term. Learning the language, learning the culture, learning the history and the sociological aspects of that society. And so even though I wasn't spending a lot of time in these countries, I really wanted to learn something, and I really hope to make long-form videos of some of these books in the near future. For people that are interested in traveling to Southeast Asia, you might be on YouTube now looking at information about the countries you're going to, but you find more tourist-oriented information and videos on YouTube that's talking about the tourist traps of where to visit. But there's not as many videos on books on Southeast Asia that are historical, that are sociological, that are based on really diving into a deeper understanding of the country in which you're traveling. And so I wanted to use this video to just overview the books that I was able to collect and or read, and I hope to do long videos on these books in the future. If you're interested, let me know. So one of the first books, just to kind of orient to Southeast Asia, is this book, The West as the Other, A Genealogy of Chinese Occidentalism. And so this book is kind of parallel to and positions itself against Edward Said's book, Orientalism. And so whereas that book focused a lot about the West and how it portrays the East, this book really focuses on the East since the dawn of its civilization and how early Chinese explorers and scholars approached the West and established relationships to the West. And by West, they meant India, they meant other Asian nations, and much less specifically Europe encounters as well. And so this was a really interesting book just to really orient towards historical Chinese scholarship, exploration, culture, and understanding. And so this was a good kind of beginning book on how to orient towards the East and Eastern understanding, Eastern scholarship, and religion, culture, and so on, to then approach the other historical and sociological books. The first and last country that I traveled to was Thailand, and so I have 4 books here on Thailand. When I first traveled to Thailand in 2005, I noticed that there was some kind of protest going on where the citizens were wearing yellow shirts and lining up on the street. And when I talked to local people, they said that those people were supporting the king. And so I really didn't understand anything more than that until reading these books. And I understand that Thailand has a king, Thailand has a military that's in charge of the government, but it seems very kind of complicated to understand. And so I wanted to read books about specifically the Thai government and how it's constituted so that I could understand further what is happening. And so I read this book, Thai Politics in Translation, Monarchy, Democracy, and the Supra-constitution. And so this is an edited anthology with different authors coming together to talk about different aspects of Thai government formation over time. These are articles that are, some of them are excerpts from historical books that have been published quite a while ago. Some of them are published more recently. And they're not all on the same ideological orientation either. So they have different political orientations. that might be in conflict, but that just provides a much more rich analysis and understanding for the author. And so I was able to understand a bit more about this balance between having a monarchy, having a military-oriented government, and the role of the people and the relationship of the people to these government structures. Following that book was another one on the government, which was called Infiltrating Society, the Thai Military's Internal Security Affairs. And this one is still in the plastic. I haven't read it yet, but I wanted to understand the role of the military in the government and its relationship to other branches of the government. So I look forward to reading this book in the future. I read this book, Forest Guardians, Forest Destroyers, The Politics of Environmental Knowledge in Northern Thailand. And this book specifically focused on North Thailand and environmental concerns, especially related to the forest, cutting down of trees, and how the indigenous groups in the mountains are related to the rhetoric and language used to talk about the issues of environmentalism and forestry. And so more specifically, the book talks about the indigenous communities that live in the mountains that have migrated through other countries from China, from Southeast Asia. And those groups include the Hmong and the Karen. One of these groups is more linguistically framed as being defenders of the forest, as the title suggests, and one of the groups is conceptualized as cutting down the trees more so. And so this book specifically focuses on the language and rhetoric around environmental issues and how these indigenous groups are constructed as being protectors of the forest or not protectors of the forest. So I was kind of surprised to see, like, academic books, they're always like super focused on a particular aspect that perhaps I wasn't expecting. But because of this book, I did travel to the mountain regions and I did visit a Karen and a Hmong village in order to really kind of understand this book a bit deeper and to visit those locations that the book discusses. I did record a video on this book and hope to publish that soon. And then I read this book on tourism called Globalization, Tourism, and Simulacra, a Baudrillardian study of tourist spaces in Thailand. This is taking Baudrillard and critical theory and applying it to a tourist context. But this book specifically focused on the floating villages that the tourists go to in Thailand. And it talked about the history of floating villages and how there was one, but the ones that the tourists go to now are very constructed for tourism, and that of course this type of floating village culture has gone by the wayside, but they've kind of recreated this village as a tourist attraction. And there's two of them outside of the main city, where one is more oriented towards Western tourists and one is more oriented towards Chinese tourists. And so this book was specifically just focusing on these two tourist sites and talking about tourism from this philosophical, critical theory perspective. I will record a video on this book where I just expand this perspective to other tourist sites in Thailand and in Southeast Asia and try to understand how Baudrillard would understand and apply his theories to tourism in Southeast Asia. And so from Thailand, I did go to Cambodia, and so I studied two of these books on Cambodia. One is called Cambodia's Curse, The Modern History of a Troubled Land, and the other is called Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy. And so these two books talk about a similar historical trajectory, but one has more detail than the other. This book is written by So-Economic, who's from Cambodia, and so has that insider perspective of really living these experiences. But this book is a very short academic treatment of Cambodian history and doesn't get the details that this journalistic book does, but it overviews the historical development of Cambodia and how it did come to rely on foreign aid, and how this is really constructed in a bad way, dependence of Cambodia on these foreign donors, how that has continued to corrupt the political system and those who are in power. But this book is written by a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Joel Brinkley, and this book was just kind of devastating to read. Every single chapter was more brutal and twisted and violent and horrifying than the last, and it overviews the history of Cambodia. We know about the Khmer Rouge and the genocide that took place that wiped out 1/4 of the population in the country, but also just how that was instigated by the U.S. bombing campaign in the region that radicalized people into these kinds of movements, the political corruption within the country, the wars that were going on in Vietnam, and just the foreign investments also that led to incredible corruption, and just the impoverishment of the people, and how this deep, deep poverty and illiteracy historically has really kept the people locked outside of power, and so these officials were able to be very corrupted. But just the challenges that all the institutions have faced, and of course the Khmer Rouge really slaughtered all of the elites, the medical doctors, the educators, and so having that branch of society just wiped out really also disenfranchised the country for development and for just being able to have a functioning healthcare system and so on. So this book is super devastating to understand the history of Cambodia and just the pressures and the negative historical aspects that came from the outside, especially from the U.S., but also from the wars that are taking place. And then just the corruption that also took place inside the country, the people themselves attacking their own people, especially with the Khmer Rouge and the genocide. But just stemming from that also, the same people are in power, and a lot of these dynamics have not completely gone away. There's so many tourists in Cambodia that are probably quite ignorant of this history. I mean, there are museums and there are monuments that show the history of this devastating genocide that took place, the killing fields. We understand those kinds of histories, but really this book gets into the details in a more graphic and horrifying way. So I definitely recommend folks really getting a grasp of the history of Cambodia, and especially as tourists, then you'll understand why Cambodia is so cheap and the people are the way they are, and to understand your place as a tourist in Cambodia within this history of inequality and oppression. I also went to Malaysia, and so I found 3 books on Malaysia. I found a bookstore in Malaysia right on the block where I was living, and this bookstore had a lot of books from Strategic Information Research Development Center. So they were pretty academic, historical, and sociological. And so I did record a video on this book, Tourism in Malaysia, an empirical study on socio-economic and environmental impacts. And so I wanted to read a book about tourism in Malaysia to understand, my relationship to Malaysia as a tourist, but it was also looking at environmental issues. And so while I was in Malaysia, I made sure to see some kind of tourist-oriented environmental sites in Malaysia, but also trying to get to more natural sites, which I didn't quite succeed in. I think I just made it to one kind of research site that was very manicured, But in the future, I would really love to go to Malaysia to really explore the natural environment in other places, especially in other locations outside of the main city. And so this just talked about the history of tourism, but also focused on the environment and the environmental impacts of tourism in Malaysia. And so one of the issues about tourism and environmentalism is that usually tourists have a much bigger impact on environmental damage and taking up of resources than the local community does, especially in developing nations. So that's something for tourists to really be aware of. I did read this book, The Imperial Agenda, the British in Malaysia from 1786 to 1957. And so this book talked about, imperialism in Malaysia. Malaysia is shaped because of its imperialist history as constructed by the British. And so it was really interesting to understand, especially just, you go to Malaysia and you think, wow, it's so diverse here. They have 4 different primary ethnic groups that are prevalent in Malaysia. But that is because of the British Empire and imperialism. People from India were brought to Malaysia, to Singapore, to around the world as labor, especially as some countries outlawed slavery. Then the British brought Indian labor into these countries. And so Malaysia is as diverse as it is because of this British imperial history. And so this book really outlined the process of how that imperialism took place and how then this new nation, post-imperialism, post-colonialism, was set up to maintain a relationship with the UK, but also to develop its own kind of course in the future. So this book was really interesting to understand the history of Malaysia. The Reluctant Nation, Malaysia and Its Vain Quest for Common Purpose. This book presented a more contemporary view of Malaysian politics and what it's gone through since its independence. And so it was a bit, difficult for me to understand as an outsider, not having this foundation in Malaysian history, which the last book provided me with, but it provided some real good insights into understanding the development of Malaysian politics and what the situation more contemporarily is in Malaysia. I went to Vietnam and was able to get some books from some Vietnamese museums that are about Ho Chi Minh, museums that are about the American War in Vietnam. And so I did read this one, Vietnam's Anti-U.S. Resistance War, The Journey to the Final Victory. And so this book is amazing for me as an American to understand the perspective of the Vietnamese fighting against these invaders that have invaded and occupied and bombed and devastated and destroyed Vietnam over what? Political ideology. And that the U.S. did lose this war to Vietnam. And so this book provides that perspective that, especially as an American, is very insightful and useful. And then I did visit the Ho Chi Minh Museum, the mausoleum. I was able to see Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum, to enter the mausoleum with thousands of other viewers to view his body. I was exposed to understanding what a brilliant scholar Ho Chi Minh was and how dedicated he was to the liberation of Vietnam and fighting the imperialists. And so I did pick up this book that is from his perspective on the liberation of Vietnam. So that was very insightful as well. I was able to pick up this book and read this before I went, called A Life of Worry, Politics, Mental Health, and Vietnam's Age of Anxiety. And so this book basically talked about and was based on interviews with folk where Vietnam, over a short period of time, a few decades, went from this war-devastated country where the biggest concern was the war and its impact. Trauma, creating these trauma for the nation, for the people. It created this kind of generational ripple effect of trauma that other people have endured, the children of these refugees or folks that stayed in Vietnam. And now that Vietnam is a very successful consumer producing society, up and coming, and they're more worried about buying their latest cell phone and excellent coffee than really remaining so traumatized by the war, which older generations might be. And so this book was overviewing just kind of this mental health and how Vietnam's anxieties went from a war-torn country to one of a consumer countries. So this is an ethnography based on interviews, and it was just interesting to understand this kind of change over time and how it's impacted the different generations in Vietnam. While I was in Thailand, they had that tragic earthquake in Myanmar and Burma, and so I of course wasn't able to travel to Myanmar or Burma, but I did pick up this book called Tragic Nation: Why and How Democracy Failed. This is the poorest nation, if not one of the poorest nations in Southeast Asia, and it's not a place that Americans can really travel to right now because of the political instability. But I did see quite a few interesting books on the country, and I picked up this one, which I haven't read yet. Singapore was the last country that I went to, and so I was able to find this book, Mobilizing Gay Singapore: Rights and Resistance in an Authoritarian State. And it was just interesting to think about, gay rights, same-sex marriage, because when I was in Thailand, they just legalized same-sex marriage about a week or two before I got there. And so even on the immigration, when in the airport, when you're getting off the plane, they have a pro-LGBTQ welcome here sign on the desk of the immigration officials when you're entering the country. And so that was just amazing to see. And Thailand is one of the more progressive countries in Southeast Asia as far as having same-sex marriage legalized just recently, having marijuana decriminalized so that you see these cannabis stores all over the place. It's not legal, but it is decriminalized and these stores are flourishing. And so understanding just that Singapore is this hyper-modern, rich country that has the best education and very progressive in scientific developments as far as being forward-thinking on environmentalism, but it is an authoritarian state that is very controlled, and that same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage are criminalized. And in most of these countries, it is the situation where it's criminalized. And for Americans and for folks coming from the West, where same-sex relationships and marriage might be legal or might be really embedded now into our societies, we have to remember that that's only about 8% of the countries in the globe that have these rights, and that the vast majority of the globe does not recognize same-sex relationships. It certainly doesn't legalize same-sex marriage, and in many countries same-sex engagement is criminalized and brutally repressed. And so that's just something for us to remember when we travel to these places. And so I wanted to understand just how same-sex relationships coexist in an authoritarian state. And there's a lot of books like this about China as well. And so thinking about China and same-sex relationships, and sometimes these relationships are really tolerated as long as you're not some kind of activist online, but just the balance of how they exist in very repressive authoritarian regimes in Asia. And finally, one of the last books that I read during my trip to Asia was called The Future is Asian: Global Order in the 21st Century. And this was a really interesting book, just thinking about how Asia and Southeast Asia has developed so quickly in the last few decades, and how they're really poised to be the top winners in the global future because of technological developments, because of the centralization of education and science and technology education, by investing in education and technology and these kinds of futuristic concepts. And just the drive of the people to really work hard and promote their national endeavors. And so this book was really a great one and a good concluding book to understand how Southeast Asia, ASEAN nations are really the future of the world. And especially as we see the U.S. and the West in decline, the U.S. is definitely an empire that's dying right now. And so the ones that are really going to take off in the future are China, Southeast Asia, and other Asian nations, which are at the forefront of thinking about environmental concerns, thinking about technologies, and thinking about really how to prepare for the future, building infrastructure. In the West, in the US, we see our infrastructure and investments in human capital and social infrastructure, social safety nets completely devastated. And this upward transfer of wealth to the top 1% and to the super wealthy, just devastating the human potential in Western countries. And so Asia and Southeast Asia, China are really trying to invest in infrastructure and human infrastructure, education, technologies. And so this book really portrays how that future trajectory could look. So in this video, I have a stack of books that I read or plan to read about Southeast Asia. But the point is that when we travel, that's a real opportunity to educate ourselves on a deeper level about the places we go to. We shouldn't just watch YouTube videos about cheap places to eat and cheap lodgings, but really understand why these places are so affordable, and this history of colonialism, this history of oppression, of militarism, of war, especially coming from some of our own countries. If you're an American, then it was really insightful and horrifying to visit all these museums to see the devastation caused by the United States on these nations that are still in effect. There's still landmines in the ground, and there's still these effects of the militarism. And what was the most disturbing to visit these museums about the American War was to see that it's still going on, that America is still centralized its military, it's still devastating countries around the world with its bombs, and that these things have not stopped. And so that's the biggest lesson, is that, Southeast Asia are trying to create these museums about how devastating the impact of war is on society. But the war nations continue on with developing their war machine. And so it's definitely a big takeaway traveling in Southeast Asia to understand that we as taxpayers are supporting these war machines, and we really need to push back against that kind of trajectory. So let me know, have you traveled to Southeast Asia and how you're able to just educate yourself on a deeper level by going to museums or reading books on the places that you travel, and just the questions that you ask local people when you're there on the ground. So thank you for joining me for my book tour of Southeast Asia. And let me know if you're interested in longer book reviews of these books, because I would love to, teach a class on the sociology of Southeast Asia. And so these books would kind of be my foundation of teaching a course on sociology of Southeast Asia.